Hey there, welcome to the unsettling lullaby. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So before you get too cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. The suburbs of St. Louis had a way of appearing untouched by chaos. Quiet streets curved gently past manicured lawns. Porch lights glowed softly against the Missouri night. To most who lived there, it was the kind of place where routines held firm and tragedies belonged to distant headlines. But on November 11, 2019, that illusion began to fracture. Jennifer Rothwell lived a life that, on the surface, seemed carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, much like the chemical formulas she worked with every day. At 30 years old, she was driven, intelligent, and quietly ambitious. Friends described her as warm but focused, the kind of woman who balanced precision with kindness. She had built a respected career as a chemical engineer, working in an industry where details mattered and mistakes could carry real consequences. Her world revolved around order. Each weekday morning, Jennifer followed the same rhythm. Early wake-up, coffee prepared just the way she liked it, a quick check of emails, and then the commute. She wasn't someone prone to sudden changes or unexplained absences. She believed in schedules, in plans, in showing up. Those who knew her best would later repeat the same haunting phrase. This wasn't like Jennifer. By early November, winter was already tightening its grip on Missouri. Cold air crept through the city, and forecasts warned of early snow. On the evening of November 10, the first flakes began to fall, light at first, almost gentle. By morning, the landscape would be dusted in white. Monday, November 11, began like any other workday. Jennifer left her home in the suburban community west of St. Louis sometime before dawn. The sky was still dark, the roads slick with overnight snow. Traffic moved cautiously. It was the kind of morning where most people drove slower, kept their headlights on longer, and focused carefully on the road ahead. According to what would later be pieced together, Jennifer was expected at work that morning, but she never arrived. At first, the absence didn't immediately trigger alarm. Winter weather often caused delays. Accidents clogged highways. Sometimes people simply called in late. But Jennifer didn't call. As the morning stretched into afternoon, concern began to build quietly among those who knew her routine best. Her phone went unanswered. Messages sat unread. For someone as consistently reliable as Jennifer Rothwell, silence itself was unusual. By that evening, the concern had grown into something heavier. That was when her husband, Bo Rothwell, reported her missing. When authorities first received the call, it followed a familiar pattern: a worried spouse, a woman who hadn't come home, a vehicle unaccounted for. On the surface, it resembled many early-stage missing persons cases, uncertain, incomplete, and full of questions. Bo told investigators that Jennifer had left for work that morning and never returned. He described her as responsible, not someone who would simply disappear. His tone, by most early accounts, carried urgency, concern, confusion. Police began the standard early steps: checking hospitals, contacting her workplace, reviewing her known movements. What they learned deepened the mystery. Jennifer had not shown up at her job. She had not contacted coworkers. Her phone activity had gone silent not long after she left home. And then, later that night, a crucial development surfaced. Jennifer's car had been found. It was located in a retail plaza parking lot not far from her home, close enough to raise eyebrows, but far enough to feel deliberate. The vehicle sat alone beneath the cold Missouri sky, lightly dusted with snow that had fallen throughout the day. Inside, investigators found something unsettling. Jennifer's belongings were still there. Her purse, her wallet, her keys. There were no immediate signs of struggle visible to the public, but the scene didn't sit right. People rarely abandon their vehicles voluntarily with everything important left behind, especially people like Jennifer, organized, methodical, cautious. Word spread quickly through the St. Louis community. By the next morning, the quiet suburbs were buzzing with concern. Local news stations picked up the story. Social media posts began circulating her photo. Friends, co-workers, and neighbors shared the same plea again and again. Have you seen Jennifer? Search efforts ramped up with increasing urgency. Volunteers bundled themselves against the biting cold and began combing nearby wooded areas, walking shoulder to shoulder through frost-covered grass. Law enforcement canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual in the early hours of November 11. Security cameras became a critical focus. Investigators pulled footage from nearby businesses and traffic intersections, trying to trace Jennifer's final confirmed movements. Every frame was examined, every timestamp scrutinized. The snow, beautiful as it appeared, had become an obstacle. It blurred tire tracks, covered footprints, erased the small details that often help investigators reconstruct the final moments of a disappearance. Weather in cases like this can become an accomplice. As days passed, the emotional temperature of the community shifted. What began as concern slowly hardened into dread. Candlelight vigils appeared in local parks. Coworkers spoke tearfully to reporters about Jennifer's dedication and kindness. Flyers bearing her smiling photograph appeared on utility poles and storefront windows across the region. Still, there were no confirmed sightings, no verified communications, no clear explanation for why her car had been left behind. Behind the scenes, detectives began building a timeline. They traced Jennifer's phone pings, reviewed traffic camera data, interviewed those closest to her. Each piece of information was small on its own, but together they began to outline the final known hours of November 11. Jennifer had left home early. She had been driving toward work. And then something had interrupted that routine. Something significant enough to stop a woman who did not deviate from plans. Investigators returned repeatedly to the parking lot where her vehicle had been found. Crime scene technicians documented every inch of the car, fibers, prints, any trace that might explain what had happened in the narrow window between her departure and her disappearance. The longer Jennifer remained missing, the more the case shifted in tone. Missing persons cases often begin with uncertainty. Many resolve quickly, miscommunications, voluntary departures, unexpected detours. But as days turned into a week, the possibility of something far more serious began to loom. Publicly, Bo Rothwell continued to speak about his missing wife, describing her as driven and beloved. He participated in interviews, appealing for information, urging anyone who might have seen Jennifer to come forward. But investigators, trained to look beyond appearances, continued their methodical work. Behind closed doors, every relationship was being quietly examined. Every timeline rechecked. Every statement compared against evidence. Meanwhile, the search on the ground continued. Volunteers pushed deeper into wooded areas near where Jennifer's car had been found. Search dogs were brought in. Drones scanned from above. Officers in heavy jackets moved slowly through the winter brush, their breath visible in the cold air. Hope at that stage still lingered, but it was beginning to thin. Because the longer someone like Jennifer Rothwell remained missing without contact, the more troubling the possibilities became. And in the quiet suburbs of St. Louis, beneath a blanket of early winter snow, the first cracks in a carefully ordered life were beginning to show. And in the quiet suburbs of St. Louis, beneath a blanket of early winter snow, the first cracks in a carefully ordered life were beginning to show. Within days of Jennifer's disappearance, investigators made a decision that would quietly shift the direction of the case. They returned to the home she shared with her husband, Bo Rothwell. From the outside, the house looked exactly as it should, neatly kept, unremarkable, the kind of suburban property that blended easily into the neighborhood. But seasoned detectives know that answers rarely sit on the surface. When officers first stepped inside, they were methodical, careful, observant. They weren't just looking for obvious signs of violence. They were looking for what didn't belong. At first glance, the home appeared orderly. Furniture was in place. Nothing seemed overturned. There were no shattered windows, no visible signs of forced entry. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like a house waiting for its owners to return. But crime scene investigators don't rely on first impressions. As they moved room to room, small irregularities began to surface, details so subtle they could easily be overlooked, areas that appeared recently cleaned, surfaces that seemed too clean. Then they reached the master bedroom. It was there that the investigation took a darker turn. Technicians noticed sections of carpet that looked freshly treated, slight discoloration, uneven texture. Under bright forensic lighting, the fibers told a different story than the one visible to the naked eye. Luminol testing began. In the dimmed room, investigators sprayed the chemical across the carpet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the floor lit up. Blue-white fluorescence bloomed across multiple areas of the bedroom carpet, an unmistakable reaction, indicating the likely presence of blood that had been cleaned. The room fell quiet, because this was no longer a routine missing persons case. The reaction patterns suggested more than a minor injury. The distribution was irregular, widespread. To trained eyes, it raised the possibility of a violent event having taken place inside the home. Samples were carefully collected. Photographs documented every glowing patch of carpet. Each swab was sealed and labeled for laboratory analysis. Meanwhile, detectives began taking a closer look at Bo's statements. Up to that point, he had maintained the same story. Jennifer left for work and never came home. But the emerging forensic picture inside the house didn't easily align with that narrative. Investigators widened their scope. Phone records were subpoenaed. Financial activity was reviewed. Digital footprints were examined with increasing scrutiny. And then another layer of the story began to surface. Behind the image of a concerned husband was a secret Bo had not initially disclosed. He had been living a double life. Detectives uncovered communications between Bo and another woman, messages that painted a picture far more complicated than a stable suburban marriage. The tone of the conversations was intimate, emotional, and in places deeply troubling. As investigators read deeper into the exchanges, the language shifted from flirtation to something colder, more calculated. In several messages, Bo discussed what he described as options regarding his marriage. The phrasing was clinical, almost detached. Rather than the language of someone considering divorce, the conversations hinted at darker considerations, ways to solve what he seemed to view as a growing personal problem. To investigators, the word choice stood out sharply. Options. It was the kind of language that raises red flags in homicide investigations. Not emotional, not impulsive, but strategic, detached, planned. By this point, forensic results from the carpet samples had returned. The substance that lit up under luminol was confirmed to be human blood. And more importantly, DNA analysis matched it to Jennifer Rothwell. The case was now moving rapidly toward a grim conclusion. Detectives brought Bo in for additional questioning. At first, he maintained his original account, but experienced interrogators noticed the subtle shifts, hesitations, inconsistencies, moments where his timeline blurred. Under mounting pressure, his story began to fracture. What had initially been presented as concern slowly gave way to contradictions. Investigators confronted him with the forensic findings, the cleaned carpet, the digital communications, the timeline gaps. The room grew heavier, with each piece of evidence laid on the table. Eventually, the breaking point came. Bo admitted there had been a confrontation inside the home on the morning Jennifer disappeared. What he described next was framed as an argument that escalated. But to investigators, the physical evidence suggested something far more deliberate. After hours of questioning, Bo agreed to take detectives to where Jennifer's body had been left. It was a cold November day when the small convoy of police vehicles made its way toward a wooded area outside the suburban neighborhoods. The trees stood bare, their branches skeletal against the gray sky. Frost clung stubbornly to the ground. Bo directed them off the main road and into a more secluded patch of woods. Officers moved carefully as he pointed toward a specific area. Search teams spread out. And then quietly, one of them called out. Jennifer had been found. Her body lay partially concealed among the winter brush, in a location that suggested deliberate placement. The discovery brought a heavy stillness over the scene, a moment that every investigator recognizes, where the search transitions fully into a homicide investigation. Forensic teams documented everything: the position of the body, the surrounding terrain, any trace evidence left behind. Each detail would later become part of the case that prosecutors would build piece by piece. In the weeks that followed, the evidence against Bo Rothwell continued to mount. Digital forensics revealed searches and behaviors that prosecutors would later characterize as premeditation. Investigators reconstructed his movements with increasing precision. The timeline, once vague, began to sharpen into something far more damning. By the time the case moved toward trial, the portrait painted by prosecutors was stark. They argued this was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was calculated, planned, executed with chilling calm. During the trial, jurors heard about the blood evidence inside the home. They saw photographs of the luminol reactions glowing across the bedroom carpet. Forensic experts explained how the cleaning attempts had failed to fully erase what happened that morning. They heard about the affair, the secret communications, the disturbing discussions about options. Perhaps most powerful of all was the digital trail, messages, searches, and behavior patterns that prosecutors said revealed Bo's state of mind in the days and weeks leading up to Jennifer's death. The defense attempted to frame the incident as the result of an argument that spiraled out of control. But the weight of the forensic evidence told a different story, one of preparation, concealment, and calculated steps taken after the violence occurred. Jurors listened. They watched. They absorbed every detail. When the verdict finally came, it carried the quiet finality that had been building since the moment Jennifer was first reported missing. Guilty. The sentencing phase followed, and the courtroom atmosphere remained heavy. Jennifer's family spoke about the woman they had lost, the driven engineer, the daughter, the friend who had built her life carefully and deliberately. When Bo Rothwell was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the legal chapter of the case came to a close. But the emotional aftermath lingered far beyond the courtroom. Because cases like Jennifer's leave behind more than a criminal record. They leave questions that echo long after the headlines fade. In the end, what remained most vivid was not the forensic evidence or the courtroom arguments, but the image of the life Jennifer Rothwell had been building. A chemical engineer with a structured mind and steady ambitions. A woman who followed routines, who showed up, who planned for the future. Her story became a quiet reminder of how violence can hide behind ordinary doors, How carefully maintained appearances can conceal fractures no one else can see. And in the suburbs where porch lights still glow against the Missouri night, Jennifer's absence remains the loudest silence of all. The wind moved low across the fields of Manitowoc County, whispering through brittle autumn grass and rattling the last stubborn leaves clinging to skeletal trees. Late October in rural Wisconsin carried a particular stillness, the kind that settles heavy in the chest, where the sky hangs pale and distant and the roads stretch on longer than they should. Out here, miles of farmland were broken only by clusters of weathered homes, rusted machinery, and salvage yards that seemed to swallow time itself. It was a place where people noticed when something was out of place. And on October 31, 2005, something was. 25-year-old Teresa Halbach moved through this quiet landscape with purpose. She was known for her easy smile, her independence, and the camera that was almost always slung over her shoulder. Photography wasn't just her job, it was how she saw the world. Through her lens, ordinary people and objects became carefully framed moments, preserved in soft Midwestern light. Teresa had built a steady routine. As a freelance photographer working primarily with Auto Trader, she spent her days driving rural routes, meeting strangers in driveways and gravel lots, photographing vehicles for classified listings. It was solitary work but predictable, safe. At least it had always been. Halloween morning broke cool and gray. Teresa started her day like many others: coffee, emails, and a carefully organized list of appointments. Her Toyota RAV4, deep green and well-traveled, carried her across the county as she moved from stop to stop, documenting cars for sale. Nothing about the day initially stood out. By early afternoon, Teresa was heading toward her final scheduled appointment, a trip to the Avery Salvage Yard, a sprawling, cluttered property tucked deep within rural Manitowoc County. The yard was vast, acres of twisted metal, stacked vehicles, and narrow dirt paths winding between piles of automotive remains. It wasn't her first time there. Records show Teresa had visited the property multiple times before for similar assignments. It was routine work, familiar territory. But October 31 would be different. Shortly after 2:00 p.m., Teresa spoke briefly on the phone as she drove. Her voice was calm, businesslike. She was confirming locations, keeping to her schedule. Nothing in her tone suggested concern. Around 2:12 p.m., her phone pinged near the Avery property. Somewhere between the rows of rusting vehicles and the quiet rural road that led in, Teresa Halbach arrived at the salvage yard. Witness accounts later placed her vehicle near the residence of Stephen Avery, a man who lived on the property with members of his family. Avery had recently contacted Auto Trader to request photos of a vehicle for sale, a blue van belonging to a relative. To Teresa, it was just another stop. She photographed the van. She made brief contact. And then the timeline fractures. No one can say with certainty what Teresa did in the minutes immediately after completing her assignment. Phone records would later show her device going silent. No outgoing calls. No confirmed sightings off the property. Just silence. As the afternoon faded into evening, Halloween festivities began across the county. Children in costumes walked door to door under dim porch lights. Families gathered. Life moved forward. But Teresa never returned home. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Her work often kept her on the road late. Missed calls weren't unheard of. But by November 2, concern began to sharpen into fear. Her mother noticed something deeply wrong. Teresa wasn't answering her phone. She hadn't checked in. And most troubling of all, she had missed a scheduled family commitment. Something those close to her said was completely out of character. By November 3, the Halbach family reported her missing. What followed was one of the largest search efforts the region had ever seen. Volunteers fanned out across Manitowoc County. Flyers bearing Teresa's photo appeared on telephone poles, gas stations, and storefront windows. Search parties combed through fields, wooded areas, and rural backroads. Law enforcement began retracing her final known movements, building the last confirmed timeline of her day. Again and again, the trail led back to one place: the Avery salvage yard. Investigators quickly realized something unsettling. Teresa's final confirmed appointment had been on that property, and no one could verify that she had ever left. On November 5, just 2 days after she was reported missing, the search took a dramatic turn. Volunteer searchers were given permission to check the salvage yard. It was a massive undertaking. The property stretched across roughly 40 acres, packed tightly with thousands of vehicles. Late that morning, one searcher moved carefully between rows of cars and scrap. The air was cold, the ground uneven beneath her feet. Then she saw it. Partially concealed among the vehicles sat a dark green SUV. The license plate matched Teresa Halbach's Toyota RAV4. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation. Crime scene tape quickly wrapped around the area. Investigators descended on the salvage yard in force. What had been a missing person case now shifted, sharply and ominously, toward something far more serious. Inside the vehicle, early observations raised immediate red flags. The RAV4 appeared deliberately hidden, backed into a tight space and partially obscured by debris and other vehicles. Branches and items had been placed around it in a way that did not look accidental. Even more troubling were the initial forensic findings. Investigators noted what appeared to be blood inside the vehicle, small but significant stains that suggested violence may have occurred. The vehicle itself became the focal point of an expanding investigation, and the location of its discovery, deep within the Avery salvage yard, narrowed the spotlight quickly. Detectives began digging into the background of Stephen Avery and the property's residents. Avery was already known to local law enforcement due to a prior wrongful conviction that had made him a controversial figure in the county. Now, with Teresa's vehicle found on his family's land, scrutiny intensified almost overnight. Search warrants followed. Investigators returned to the salvage yard again and again, combing through buildings, vehicles, burn areas, and surrounding land. Each pass brought mounting tension. Each new piece of evidence seemed to deepen the mystery. Meanwhile, the Halbach family waited, caught in the agonizing space between hope and dread. The quiet fields of Manitowoc County no longer felt still. They felt watchful. And somewhere within that sprawling salvage yard, investigators were beginning to believe that the truth about Teresa Halbach's final moments was buried beneath rusted metal, ash, and silence. The case was only just beginning to unfold. The investigation was only just beginning to unfold. In the days that followed the discovery of Teresa Halbach's RAV4, the focus tightened around the Avery property like a slowly closing fist. Detectives moved methodically through the salvage yard, documenting, photographing, collecting. Each search warrant peeled back another layer of the case, and with each layer came more questions than answers. But it wasn't only Stephen Avery who began to draw attention. Investigators soon turned their eyes toward a quiet, withdrawn teenager who lived nearby on the same family property, Brendan Dassey. 16 years old, soft-spoken, described by teachers as shy and academically struggling. Brendan was Stephen Avery's nephew, and at first he seemed like a peripheral figure, someone who might have seen something, heard something, noticed something unusual that Halloween afternoon. What followed would become one of the most controversial interrogation sequences in modern American criminal history. In November 2005, Brendan was first interviewed casually at school. Investigators approached him gently at first, framing their questions as routine. Brendan's answers were hesitant, often vague. He said he had been home. He mentioned a bonfire. Nothing in those early conversations suggested direct involvement. But detectives kept coming back, and the tone slowly shifted. By February 2006, Brendan was brought in for a lengthy interrogation at the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. He sat alone in a small, windowless room across from seasoned investigators. There was no parent present during key portions of the questioning. No attorney. Only Brendan, and the steady, mounting pressure of the men across the table. The interrogation stretched for hours. At first, Brendan denied knowing anything about Teresa Halbach's disappearance. His voice was quiet, uncertain. He frequently responded with "I don't know" or "I guess." But the investigators pressed harder, using leading questions, suggesting details, encouraging him to be honest. Again and again, they told him they already knew what happened. They just needed him to say it. Over time, Brendan's story began to change. Piece by piece, under persistent questioning, he began to agree with investigators' suggestions. He nodded when details were offered. He corrected himself when told he was wrong. The narrative that emerged was graphic and disturbing, a confession describing Teresa being assaulted and killed inside Stephen Avery's trailer. But even in the moment, the confession raised red flags. Brendan frequently contradicted himself. Key details shifted. At several points, investigators appeared to feed him critical facts, including the suggestion that Teresa had been shot in the head, something Brendan had not initially mentioned. Still, the confession became a cornerstone of the case. To prosecutors, it was devastating corroboration. To the defense, and later to millions of viewers, it looked deeply troubling. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued their painstaking search of the Avery property. Days after the RAV4 was discovered, investigators made another critical find inside Stephen Avery's trailer bedroom: a single ignition key for Teresa Halbach's vehicle. The key was located on the floor beside Avery's bed during a search conducted by members of the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, the same department that had previously been involved in Avery's wrongful conviction years earlier. The discovery immediately intensified suspicion, but it also ignited controversy. Defense attorneys would later argue the key's sudden appearance, after multiple prior searches of the same room, suggested the possibility of evidence planting. Investigators strongly denied this, maintaining the search was thorough and legitimate. The key itself carried Stephen Avery's DNA, but notably absent was Teresa's. For many observers, that detail would become one of the case's most fiercely debated points. The most haunting discovery came from the burn pit behind Stephen Avery's garage. Investigators had already noted that Avery reported having a bonfire on the night of October 31. Burn areas across the property were carefully examined. Sifting teams worked slowly through layers of ash, melted debris, and hardened soil. Then came the fragments. Small charred bone. Forensic anthropologists would later determine that the remains were consistent with Teresa Halbach. Additional fragments were recovered from nearby burn barrels on the property, deepening the prosecution's theory that her body had been burned in an attempt to destroy evidence. The burn pit became one of the most emotionally powerful pieces of the case. To prosecutors, it told a grim and coherent story. To the defense, it raised troubling questions about evidence handling, scene security, and the possibility that materials had been moved or introduced after the fact. The case was rapidly transforming into something much larger than a missing person investigation. It was becoming a national flashpoint. In early 2007, the trial of Stephen Avery began in a Wisconsin courtroom packed with reporters, observers, and members of Teresa Halbach's grieving family. The prosecution presented a narrative of calculated violence. They argued that Avery, having lured Teresa to the salvage yard under the pretense of photographing a vehicle, attacked and murdered her, then attempted to cover his tracks by burning her body and hiding her vehicle on the property. Brendan Dassey's confession, they argued, provided chilling confirmation of what happened inside the trailer. Physical evidence the key. The blood inside the RAV4, the bone fragments formed the backbone of their case. But the defense came forward with a radically different story. They did not merely argue reasonable doubt. They alleged something far more explosive. That evidence had been planted. Avery's defense team pointed to the history between Avery and local law enforcement, particularly his prior wrongful conviction and the civil lawsuit he had filed against Manitowoc County at the time of Teresa's disappearance. They argued investigators had both motive and opportunity to frame him. They questioned the timing of the key discovery. They challenged the handling of the burn pit. They scrutinized the blood evidence found inside the RAV4, even suggesting the possibility it had been taken from a vial of Avery's blood preserved from his earlier case. Prosecutors forcefully rejected these claims, calling them baseless conspiracy theories unsupported by the facts. The courtroom became a battleground of dueling narratives, and the public was riveted. In March 2007, Stephen Avery was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Months later, Brendan Dassey, tried separately, was also convicted, largely based on his confession. But the story did not end there. Nearly a decade later, in 2015, the release of the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer reignited global attention on the case. The series, painstakingly assembled over years of footage, presented the investigation and trial through a lens that many viewers found deeply unsettling. It highlighted the interrogation of Brendan Dassey, the contested forensic evidence, and the defense's claims of possible misconduct. The impact was immediate and enormous. Millions around the world watched. Petitions calling for Avery's release gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Legal experts, journalists, and armchair detectives began dissecting every piece of the case. Online forums exploded with debate. To some viewers, the documentary exposed a deeply flawed investigation. To others, it omitted key facts and unfairly cast doubt on a legitimate conviction. The divide was sharp and emotional. In the years since, Avery's post-conviction attorney, Kathleen Zellner, has continued to file motions seeking new forensic testing and potential exoneration. Her filings have introduced alternative suspect theories, challenged evidence interpretation, and pushed for advanced DNA analysis using newer technologies. So far, the courts have repeatedly upheld Avery's conviction. Brendan Dassey's case has followed its own complex legal path. At one point, a federal judge ruled his confession involuntary, only for higher courts to later reinstate the conviction. As of today, his fate remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. The legal battles continue, slow, methodical, and unresolved in the court of public opinion. Lost beneath the arguments, the documentaries, and the endless speculation is the person at the center of it all. Teresa Halbach. Those who knew her remember a woman full of warmth and quiet determination. She loved photography, travel, and capturing moments that others might overlook. Her family has consistently urged the public to remember her, not just the controversy that followed her death. Because beyond the headlines and the courtroom drama lies a sobering truth. A young woman drove to a routine work appointment on an ordinary autumn afternoon and never came home. Nearly 2 decades later, The case of Teresa Halbach remains one of the most complex and fiercely debated criminal investigations in modern American history. A haunting intersection of grief, justice, doubt, and the fragile trust placed in the systems meant to deliver the truth. And in the cold, rural silence of Manitowoc County, the questions still echo. The early autumn wind moved quietly through the flat, open stretches of Minot, carrying with it the dry rustle of prairie grass and the faint promise of an approaching winter. In this part of North Dakota, life moved at a steady, predictable pace. People worked hard. They knew their neighbors, and when something unusual happened, word traveled fast. For most of his life, Stephen Riley had lived quietly within that rhythm. He wasn't flashy. Friends described him as steady, thoughtful, the kind of man who preferred routine over risk. He worked hard, kept close to a small circle, and built a life that, while modest, was stable. In Minot, stability was something people valued. By the summer of 2023, Stephen was in his early 50s and still very much rooted in the routines that had shaped his adult life. He had long-term plans, but nothing extravagant. Like many people in the region, he was focused on practical things: work, bills, relationships, and the slow accumulation of small comforts. Then everything changed. It began with a phone call that sounded almost too surreal to be real. Somewhere in the complex web of extended family connections and estate settlements, Stephen had been named the beneficiary of a massive inheritance, nearly $30 million. The number alone was enough to stop conversation mid-sentence. For a man who had spent his life living modestly, the news landed like a lightning strike. $30 million. Friends later said Stephen was stunned at first, almost disbelieving. It wasn't the kind of news you absorbed quickly. But as the reality began to settle in, so did something else: cautious excitement. For the first time in his life, the future looked radically different. By early September 2023, the air in Minot had begun to cool, carrying the first hints of fall. Stephen had started talking more openly about what the inheritance might mean. Nothing extravagant, not at first. Those who knew him said he wasn't suddenly dreaming of yachts or mansions. Instead, his plans were practical. Pay off debts. Maybe relocate somewhere warmer during the winter months. Help family. Invest carefully. It was the kind of grounded thinking people expected from him. At the center of his daily life during this time was his long-term girlfriend, Ine Kenya. The two had been together for years. To outsiders, the relationship appeared stable, if somewhat quiet. They shared routines, shared space, shared the ordinary rhythms of a long-term partnership. Friends didn't describe dramatic fights or obvious turmoil. But behind closed doors, subtle tensions may have already been forming, tensions that would only become visible in hindsight. Because as Stephen's anticipated windfall grew more real, so did the stakes. September moved forward. Legal arrangements were underway. Paperwork was being prepared. Stephen was scheduled to meet with an attorney to finalize key steps in claiming the inheritance. It was, by all accounts, one of the most important weeks of his life. Then suddenly, everything began to unravel. In early September, just days before he was supposed to meet with the lawyer handling the estate, Stephen started feeling unwell. At first, it didn't seem alarming. He complained of nausea, fatigue, general discomfort. Nothing that immediately suggested a medical emergency. In a place like North Dakota, where seasonal illness and stomach bugs weren't uncommon, it was easy to assume he had simply picked up something minor. But the symptoms didn't fade. They intensified. Within a short period, Stephen's condition began to deteriorate in ways that worried those around him. Friends would later recall that his decline felt unusually fast and unusually severe. He became weak, disoriented, increasingly ill. What should have been an exciting week, meetings with lawyers, discussions about the future, was rapidly turning into something far more frightening. Those closest to Stephen began to notice something was very wrong. Phone conversations became shorter, strained by his fatigue. His energy dropped sharply. At times, he reportedly seemed confused, struggling to maintain focus during conversations that normally would have been routine. Still, the full gravity of the situation wasn't immediately clear. Until it was. As his condition worsened, concern escalated quickly. Stephen was eventually rushed to the hospital in Minot, his symptoms now severe enough to trigger real alarm among medical staff. What doctors saw was troubling. His body was shutting down. Organ systems were under stress. The pattern of symptoms didn't neatly match common illnesses. And time was slipping away. While Stephen fought to stabilize in the hospital, those around him began to retrace the previous days, searching for anything that might explain his sudden collapse. What had he eaten? Where had he been? Had he been exposed to anything unusual? In cases like this, answers often come slowly. But investigators would later focus closely on the narrow window of time just before his symptoms began, a window that included meals and drinks shared at home. And attention, quietly at first, began to drift toward Ine Kenya. Witnesses would later describe moments during Stephen's decline that struck them as off. Subtle things, behavior that didn't quite align with the urgency of the situation. Statements that, in hindsight, seemed oddly detached. At the time, however, the priority was keeping Stephen alive. Doctors worked urgently, but his condition continued to spiral. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Stephen's health was failing rapidly. What had started as vague illness had progressed into a life-threatening medical crisis. Physicians began running more extensive toxicology and metabolic tests, searching for any hidden explanation. Because something about the case wasn't adding up. The speed of decline, the specific pattern of organ distress, the lack of a clear infectious cause. Experienced medical professionals know when an illness follows a familiar script. This one didn't. As results began to return, concern deepened. There were indications, subtle at first, that Stephen may have been exposed to a toxic substance. The possibility shifted the entire tone of the situation from medical mystery to potential criminal investigation. Outside the hospital room, friends and family waited in growing dread. Inside, Stephen Riley was running out of time. As investigators quietly began gathering information, they started mapping the timeline backward from the moment Stephen fell ill. The closer they looked, the narrower the window became. And increasingly, the focus returned to the same question. What happened in the days just before Stephen Riley was supposed to claim $30 million? Because somewhere between the promise of sudden wealth and the sterile urgency of a hospital room, something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. And the answers, investigators would soon discover, might have been sitting much closer to home than anyone initially imagined. And the answers, investigators would soon discover, might have been sitting much closer to home than anyone initially imagined. Inside the hospital, the tone shifted from urgent uncertainty to quiet alarm as laboratory results began to return. Physicians had been working against the clock, watching Stephen Riley's condition deteriorate in ways that defied common medical explanations. His blood chemistry was profoundly abnormal. His organs were struggling. And still, no routine illness seemed to fit the pattern. Then came the toxicology findings. In careful, clinical language, the report identified the presence of ethylene glycol in Stephen's system, the primary toxic component found in common automotive antifreeze. For the medical team, The implication was immediate and chilling. Ethylene glycol poisoning is rare, but unmistakable when it reaches advanced stages. The chemical metabolizes in the body into compounds that attack the kidneys, disrupt the blood's acid balance, and slowly, sometimes deceptively, shut down vital systems. Early symptoms can resemble ordinary illness: nausea, dizziness, fatigue. But untreated, it is devastating and often fatal. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the amount detected in Stephen's body. This was not trace environmental exposure. It suggested significant ingestion. The hospital notified authorities. What had begun as a medical emergency was now unmistakably a criminal investigation. Detectives in Minot moved quickly. Poisoning cases require speed. Evidence can disappear, memories can shift, and the narrow window of provable facts can close fast. Investigators began reconstructing Stephen Riley's final healthy days with meticulous care. Every meal, every drink, every person who had contact with him. And again, the timeline narrowed toward one person: Inez Kenwer. At first, Inez presented herself as a worried partner. She spoke calmly with officers, explaining that Stephen had simply become ill, possibly from heat exposure, she suggested. At one point, she reportedly floated the idea that he may have suffered heat stroke. But detectives were already uneasy. Heat stroke did not explain ethylene glycol. It did not explain the metabolic findings. And it certainly did not explain the growing inconsistencies in Inez's statements. Because as interviews continued, her story began to shift. Small details changed. Timelines blurred. What she initially described as sudden illness began to morph into more complicated explanations. Investigators are trained to notice these subtle movements in a narrative, the quiet places where truth and fabrication begin to separate. And they were noticing. As the investigation deepened, detectives began examining the couple's home environment. Search warrants were obtained. Officers documented the kitchen, the garbage, the refrigerator, every potential point of ingestion. What they were looking for was simple in concept, but often difficult in practice. The delivery method. Ethylene glycol poisoning rarely happens by accident in adults. The substance has a slightly sweet taste, which historically made it dangerous when mixed into beverages. But modern antifreeze formulas often contain bittering agents to deter ingestion. Still, it remained a known method in intentional poisonings. Investigators focused heavily on the drinks Stephen had consumed in the days before his collapse. Witness accounts began to matter more. Friends reported that Inez frequently prepared beverages for Stephen. Nothing unusual on its face, long-term partners often do. But in the context of the toxicology results, those routine acts took on new significance. Then came the physical evidence. During the search, investigators located containers consistent with automotive fluids. Laboratory testing would later become critical in determining whether any of those substances matched the chemical profile found in Stephen's blood. Meanwhile, detectives turned to digital evidence, often the silent witness in modern investigations. Phones, search histories, messages, financial records. What they uncovered would begin to reshape the entire narrative. Behind the scenes, a troubling financial reality was emerging. While Stephen Riley believed he was on the verge of receiving a massive inheritance, nearly $30 million, investigators began verifying the claim through legal and financial channels. What they found was startling. There was no confirmed inheritance, no verified estate transfer, no legitimate documentation supporting the windfall Stephen believed was coming. Instead, evidence suggested he had been the target of a sophisticated inheritance scam. the kind that preys on hope and confusion, often using convincing but fraudulent communications to make victims believe they are about to receive life-changing sums of money. To Stephen, the fortune had seemed real, but to investigators, it appeared increasingly clear. The money never existed. This discovery cast Inez Kenwer's behavior in an entirely new and disturbing light. Detectives began examining whether she knew or believed the inheritance was real. Financial records and communications became crucial. Investigators looked for signs of anticipation, planning, or sudden financial interest tied to Stephen's expected payout. What emerged painted a deeply unsettling picture. According to prosecutors, Inez had become increasingly focused on the potential windfall. Witness statements and digital evidence suggested she believed Stephen was about to come into a massive sum of money, and more importantly, that she stood to benefit from it. The motive, investigators theorized, was brutally simple. If Stephen died after receiving the inheritance, she might gain access to the money. It was a plan built on two fatal misunderstandings: that the inheritance was real, and that the poisoning would not be traced. As forensic testing continued, investigators worked to link the ethylene glycol exposure directly to the household environment. Beverage containers were analyzed. Residue testing was conducted. Timeline reconstruction became increasingly precise. Piece by piece, prosecutors would later argue, the evidence pointed toward deliberate poisoning. Witnesses described Inez preparing drinks. Toxicology confirmed ingestion. Digital records suggested financial motivation. And her shifting explanations raised growing suspicion. By the time detectives completed their core investigative phase, the case had transformed from medical mystery into a focused homicide investigation. The arrest came quietly but decisively. Inez Kenwer was taken into custody and formally charged in connection with Stephen Riley's death. The news rippled quickly through Minot, the kind of case that unsettles tight-knit communities where people believe they understand the lives unfolding around them. In court, prosecutors laid out a methodical narrative. They described a woman who believed her partner was about to receive millions. A woman who allegedly acted on that belief. A woman who, they argued, used antifreeze, a common household automotive chemical, as a deadly weapon. The defense pushed back, questioning intent and interpretation of the evidence. As in many poisoning cases, the battle centered not only on what happened, but what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. But the toxicology was powerful, and the timeline was tight. Ultimately, Inez Kenwer was convicted for her role in Stephen Riley's poisoning. The courtroom outcome brought legal closure, but not emotional simplicity. Because beneath the clinical facts and courtroom arguments lay one of the most tragic ironies imaginable: the $30 million inheritance that allegedly motivated the crime was never real. Stephen Riley died believing his life was about to change forever, that decades of ordinary struggle were about to give way to financial freedom and security. Instead, he had been caught in the crosshairs of deception on two fronts. One digital, one deadly personal. In the quiet stretches of Minot, the case left a lingering unease that numbers and verdicts could not erase. It was a story about trust and how easily it can be weaponized, about hope and how dangerously powerful it can become in the wrong hands, and about a man who spent his final days believing fortune was just within reach, never knowing that the promise of sudden wealth had already set something far darker in motion. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, one truth remained painfully clear. The fortune that drove the crime never existed, but the loss it left behind was painfully, irrevocably real. The spring air in Orange County carried the soft warmth of a Southern California evening, the kind of mild, golden dusk that usually promised nothing more sinister than traffic on the freeway and the distant echo of laughter from neighborhood parks. But in early May of 2013, something was already wrong. Long before the missing posters appeared, long before the search helicopters circled overhead, long before anyone would speak her name in the past tense, Maribel Ramos was exactly the kind of person who built her life on forward motion. Born into a close-knit family and shaped by discipline early on, Maribel had chosen a path defined by service. She enlisted in the United States Army as a young woman and spent years in uniform, stationed overseas and stateside, building a reputation among fellow soldiers as dependable, focused, and quietly determined. Military life suited her. It gave structure to her natural drive and sharpened the resilience that friends say already lived deep in her character. After completing her service, Maribel didn't slow down, she redirected. Education was next. By 2013, she was enrolled at California State University, Fullerton, pursuing a degree in criminal justice. It wasn't a casual choice. Those who knew her said she was deeply committed to the field, fascinated by the mechanics of law enforcement, the structure of investigations, the pursuit of accountability. She wasn't just earning a degree. She was building a future. Graduation was only weeks away. Her family talked about it constantly. Friends remember her excitement, controlled but unmistakable. Years of military service followed by years of study were about to culminate in a milestone she had worked relentlessly to reach. Everything about Maribel's life in early 2013 suggested momentum. Until it stopped. On the evening of May 2, 2013, Maribel was supposed to be exactly where she almost always was on a weekday night, on the softball field. She rarely missed games. Teammates described her as reliable to the point of predictability. If Maribel said she would be somewhere, she showed up, on time, ready, focused. So when game time came and went without her arrival, the first reaction wasn't panic. It was confusion. Teammates sent messages, called her phone, waited, but Maribel never appeared. For many people, missing a recreational game might not raise immediate alarms. Life happens, schedules shift, phones die. But this was Maribel Ramos, and the absence didn't fit. By the next morning, concern began to sharpen. She wasn't answering calls. She hadn't contacted teammates. And most unsettling of all, she was approaching one of the most important moments of her life. Her college graduation ceremony. Someone weeks away from that milestone doesn't simply vanish from routine without explanation. Her family knew it. Her friends felt it. And before long, law enforcement in Orange County was notified that something was very wrong. When officers began their initial welfare check, they were led to the apartment Maribel shared with a man named K.C. Joy. On paper, the arrangement was practical. Joy was a fellow student at Cal State Fullerton, and the two had been sharing the residence for some time. Roommate situations, especially in expensive Southern California, were common and often purely logistical. But almost immediately, something about the environment raised quiet concern. Officers noted tension in the air. Not overt chaos, not obvious signs of violence, but the subtle kind of unease that seasoned investigators learned to recognize. The feeling that a space has recently held conflict, even if the surfaces appear undisturbed. Joy himself would soon become a focal point of early investigative attention. During initial interactions with police, K.C. Joy presented as cooperative, but observers would later describe his demeanor as unusual. Flat at times, overly talkative at others. His explanations about when he had last seen Maribel, lacked the kind of crisp clarity investigators often expect in missing person cases involving close contacts. According to early accounts, Joy stated that Marable had left the apartment days earlier following a dispute between the two. He described tension over rent payments and living arrangements, the kind of roommate conflict that, on its face, was not unheard of. But something about the story didn't fully settle. Because while disagreements between roommates are common, people weeks away from graduation rarely abandon their entire lives without warning. Inside the shared apartment, investigators began documenting the environment carefully. Marable's belongings were still present. Important items, personal effects, things people typically take if they intend to leave voluntarily. Her vehicle was accounted for. Her phone activity had abruptly dropped off. And the timeline, the tight, narrowing timeline, kept pointing back to the same critical window inside that apartment. Detectives are trained to watch behavior as closely as evidence. And in the days that followed, Joy's behavior continued to draw quiet scrutiny. Witnesses would later describe moments where he appeared oddly detached from the growing concern surrounding Marable's disappearance. At times, he inserted himself into conversations about the search. At others, he seemed withdrawn, watchful. Not enough for an arrest, but enough to keep investigators paying very close attention. Meanwhile, the community began to mobilize. Missing person flyers bearing Marable's photograph spread quickly across Orange County. Family members organized search efforts. Volunteers gathered in parking lots and public parks, forming coordinated teams that moved through neighborhoods, hiking trails, and open spaces. Search dogs were deployed. Helicopters scanned from above. Each passing day without answers thickened the atmosphere of dread. Because statistically, and investigators know this all too well, the first 48 to 72 hours in a disappearance are often critical. And that window was already closing. Friends of Marable spoke openly about how out of character her disappearance was. She had plans, commitments, responsibilities she took seriously. The idea that she had simply walked away from her life didn't align with the woman they knew. Privately, investigators were reaching the same conclusion. The case was beginning to shift, subtly at first, but unmistakably, from missing person toward something far more serious. Back at the apartment, detectives continued their methodical work. Interviews, timeline reconstruction, digital analysis. Every phone ping, every message, every small behavioral detail was being layered into a growing investigative picture. And increasingly, the space Marable had shared with KC. Joy was beginning to feel less like the last known location of a missing woman, and more like the quiet center of something much darker. Outside, the Southern California evenings remained deceptively calm, palm trees swaying gently, traffic humming along familiar routes, life continuing as it always did. But behind the closed door of that Orange County apartment, investigators were beginning to suspect that whatever had happened to Marable Ramos had not happened by accident, and more like the quiet center of something much darker. Investigators in Orange County had reached the stage of the case where patience becomes strategy. There was not yet enough to charge KC Joy, but there was far too much unease to look away. So they watched. Surveillance, when done well, is quiet and methodical, a slow gathering of behavioral truth. Detectives began tracking Joy's movements, documenting his routines, noting every stop, every errand, every deviation from the ordinary. At first, nothing leapt out. He went to class, ran errands, maintained a surface-level normalcy that, to an untrained eye, might have suggested innocence. But investigators were not looking for obvious panic. They were looking for cracks, and on May 16, 2013, one finally appeared. That afternoon, Joy drove to the Orange Public Library. Public libraries are not unusual stops, and under ordinary circumstances, the visit might have meant nothing. Except Joy was already under quiet scrutiny, and detectives followed. Inside the library, Joy moved with the casual purpose of someone performing a routine task. He logged onto a public computer terminal and began searching the internet. To anyone passing behind him, it might have looked like ordinary browsing. But digital footprints have a way of preserving what human memory sometimes misses. Investigators would later recover the search history from that library session. And what they found would change everything. Among the queries was a phrase that would become central to the case. How long does a body take to decay? It was not phrased academically, not framed as coursework, not connected to any legitimate research assignment. It was blunt, specific, and chilling. But the search history did not stop there. Joy had also accessed satellite mapping tools, zooming into a remote area of Orange County, a rugged stretch of land known as Majiska Canyon. Investigators studying the digital record noticed something immediately unsettling. Joy wasn't casually browsing the area. He was zooming with precision, focusing, adjusting the view repeatedly over a particular section of terrain. To seasoned detectives, it looked less like curiosity and more like confirmation. The surveillance team moved quickly. Within hours of reviewing the library data, investigators organized a targeted search of the area Joy had examined online. Majiska Canyon was not easily accessible terrain. It was quiet, rugged, and thick with brush, the kind of place where something could remain hidden for a long time if no one knew where to look. But now they did. Search teams moved carefully through the area, guided by GPS coordinates pulled directly from Joy's digital trail. The air in the canyon was still, heavy with the dry scent of earth and chaparral. Then, not far off a narrow dirt path, investigators noticed disturbed soil. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but trained eyes caught the irregularity, a shallow depression, subtle but out of place in the otherwise undisturbed ground. Excavation began slowly, carefully, layer by layer, and then they found her. The remains of Maribel Ramos lay buried in a shallow grave, hidden in the quiet isolation of Majiska Canyon. For the search teams and later for her family, the discovery was both devastating and clarifying. The case was no longer a disappearance. It was a homicide. With the discovery of the body, the investigation accelerated rapidly. Detectives moved to bring K.C. Joy in for formal questioning. This time, the tone was very different. They now had digital evidence placing him at the center of highly suspicious activity. They had a burial site linked directly to his online searches. And they had a narrowing window of opportunity. Joy's demeanor during questioning would later be described as increasingly strained. The calm, slightly detached roommate persona was beginning to fracture under the weight of mounting evidence. Meanwhile, prosecutors began assembling what would become the backbone of their case. Because the digital trail was only part of the story. As investigators dug deeper into Joy's relationship with Maribel, a troubling emotional picture began to emerge. According to the prosecution's later theory, Joy had developed an unreciprocated romantic fixation on his roommate. Witnesses described moments of tension inside the apartment in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Disagreements over rent, over living arrangements, over boundaries that Maribel had reportedly made clear. To prosecutors, the motive crystallized into something tragically familiar. Rejection, financial stress, resentment. They argued that on or around May 2, 2013, The night Marable failed to appear at her softball game, an argument inside the apartment escalated beyond control. What happened in those final moments inside the residence would never be witnessed by anyone else. But prosecutors believe the aftermath told its own story. Joy's inconsistent statements, his internet searches, his precise mapping of the burial site, the shallow grave in Majiska Canyon. Together, they formed what the state described as a clear and deliberate chain of evidence. The trial of K.C. Joy drew intense attention across Southern California. The courtroom in Orange County filled regularly with observers, some drawn by the disturbing digital evidence, others by the heartbreaking portrait of a decorated Army veteran whose life had been cut short just weeks before graduation. Prosecutors presented the timeline methodically. They walked jurors through Joy's behavior after Marable's disappearance. They highlighted the library searches, displayed the satellite map activity, and carefully connected the coordinates to the location where Marable's body had been found. Perhaps most powerfully, they emphasized the personal context, the strained roommate relationship, and the alleged fixation that, they argued, had turned deadly. The defense pushed back, questioning interpretation, intent, and the weight of circumstantial evidence. But the digital footprint proved difficult to explain away. Because unlike eyewitness memory, the computer logs did not waver. They did not forget, and they did not change under pressure. In 2014, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. For Marable's family, the moment was heavy with emotion, relief, grief, and the complicated stillness that often follows long-awaited answers. There is no true victory in a courtroom when a life has been taken. Only resolution. Only the slow beginning of acceptance. In the months and years that followed, Marable Ramos was remembered not for the way her life ended, but for the disciplined, determined path she had been walking. A U.S. Army veteran, a criminal justice student weeks from graduation, a teammate who never missed practice, a daughter and friend whose future had been bright with purpose. In Orange County, the canyon where she was found eventually returned to its quiet stillness, the dry wind moving through brush, the trails once again walked by hikers unaware of the history beneath their feet. But for those who knew Marable, and for those who followed the case, the silence carries a different weight, a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can intersect with extraordinary darkness, and of a woman whose life of service deserved far more time than she was given. In the early 1990s, life in Springfield moved with a steady, suburban rhythm, the kind built on morning commutes into nearby Washington, evening porch lights, and the quiet confidence that nothing truly terrible happened on streets lined with trimmed lawns and maple trees. It was the kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's cars, where children rode bikes in slow circles on cul-de-sacs, where doors, more often than not, were locked out of habit rather than fear. By the fall of 1993, the community had settled comfortably into that sense of routine safety. Families prepared for the coming holidays. School schedules filled kitchen calendars. The air carried the dry, rustling hint of late autumn in northern Virginia. No one expected the silence of one particular home to become the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the county for decades. Robin Lawrence was, by all accounts, building an ordinary life, the kind many young parents quietly hope for. She was devoted to her small daughter, focused on work and family, and known among friends as warm, attentive, and grounded. There was nothing in the days leading up to November 1993 that suggested danger was close. Nothing that hinted the ordinary routines inside her Springfield home were about to be violently interrupted. The discovery came with the kind of slow, creeping dread that investigators learned to recognize immediately. It began when concern was raised after Robin failed to respond to calls and didn't appear for expected commitments. At first, the worry was mild, the kind that comes when someone is simply running late or distracted by the demands of parenting. But as hours stretched into the next day, the concern hardened into something sharper. A welfare check was requested. When authorities arrived at the residence, the exterior gave nothing away. The home sat quietly among its neighbors, indistinguishable from the others along the street. No broken windows, no obvious signs of forced entry. Just stillness. Inside, that stillness shattered. Robin Lawrence was found dead within the home, the victim of a violent homicide that immediately stunned responding officers. The scene bore the unmistakable markers of a personal and brutal attack. And then came the detail that made the moment even more heartbreaking. Elsewhere in the house, Robin's young daughter was found alive. Unharmed, physically safe, but alone in a home that had just become a crime scene. For seasoned investigators, moments like that carry a particular emotional weight. The contrast is jarring. The violence of one room, the fragile innocence of another. It raised immediate, urgent questions. If this had been a random intruder, why spare the child? If it had been targeted, what was the motive? Detectives from the Fairfax County Police Department moved quickly in those early hours. The home was secured. Forensic teams began their careful, methodical work. Every surface was photographed, every potential point of entry examined. But from the very beginning, the case carried an unsettling problem. Nothing about it was clean. There were signs of violence, but no obvious weapon left behind. No clear forced entry. No immediate suspect waiting at the edges of the investigation. In many homicide cases, the first 48 hours produce at least one strong direction: a relationship conflict, a robbery gone wrong, a witness who saw something out of place. Here, the trail felt strangely thin. Investigators began with the inner circle. Family, friends, coworkers, anyone who had recent contact with Robin Lawrence was interviewed. Detectives mapped her final known movements with painstaking care, reconstructing the last days and hours of her life. They looked for tension, disputes, financial stress, romantic conflict, anything that might suggest motive. But the picture that emerged was frustratingly ordinary. Robin was not known to be involved in dangerous situations. There were no obvious threats, no public conflicts that immediately explained the violence inside her home. For detectives accustomed to cases that begin to reveal their shape early, this one resisted clarity. As the days passed, the investigation widened. Neighborhood canvasses were conducted. Officers went door to door, asking the quiet but critical questions. Had anyone seen unfamiliar vehicles, heard unusual noises, noticed anything out of place the night before? In suburban neighborhoods, small observations sometimes become the key that unlocks everything. But here, the responses were largely the same. No one had seen anything clearly suspicious. No one had heard a disturbance significant enough to trigger alarm. If the killer had moved through the neighborhood, they had done so quietly, deliberately, carefully enough to leave almost no immediate trail. Forensic evidence was processed through the best technology available in 1993. Fingerprints were compared, physical evidence cataloged. Detectives pursued every lead that surfaced, and in the early weeks, there were many. Tips came in from the public, some promising, some quickly ruled out. Each one required time, manpower, and careful verification. One by one, they began to fade. Dead ends are not unusual in major investigations, But the speed at which this case seemed to lose traction was deeply frustrating for the investigative team. Behind closed doors, the pressure was mounting. A young mother had been murdered in her own home. Her child had been left alive just rooms away. And the person responsible had seemingly vanished without a trace. Months passed, then years. The case remained open, but the energy of the initial investigation slowly began to cool, not from lack of effort, but from lack of viable new evidence. Detectives rotated through assignments. Leads were periodically rechecked. Evidence was preserved carefully for the future. But the central questions remained stubbornly unanswered. Who had killed Robin Lawrence? And why? In the Springfield community, the impact lingered long after the headlines faded. Residents who had once felt comfortably insulated by suburban normalcy became more cautious. Doors were checked twice at night. Strange cars were noticed more quickly. Because one truth had settled in quietly but firmly. If something like this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. For Robin's family, time did not soften the loss. It simply stretched the unanswered questions across decades. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Her daughter grew up in the long shadow of a case that never reached resolution. Inside the files of the Fairfax County Police Department, the investigation remained active but unresolved. A thick case binder marked by years of careful but incomplete work. Cold cases rarely go silent all at once. They fade gradually, lead by lead, hope by hope, until what remains is a quiet, persistent absence. More than 3 decades later, the murder of Robin Lawrence still echoes through the records of Fairfax County, a case defined not only by the violence that occurred in November 1993, but by the long, unanswered stretch that followed. A quiet home, a spared child, a killer who slipped into the Northern Virginia night and was never definitively identified, and a community that learned, far too suddenly, how fragile the illusion of safety can be. And the silence that settled over the case did not mean the investigation was forgotten. Inside the evidence rooms of the Fairfax County Police Department, the materials from November 1993 were preserved with deliberate care, sealed, cataloged, and stored against the slow march of time. Detectives rotated through assignments, units reorganized, technology advanced, but one quiet constant remained. Robin Lawrence's case was never closed. Years passed, then decades. In Springfield, the neighborhood where the crime had unfolded continued its suburban rhythm. Families moved in and out. Children grew up. The sharp edge of community fear softened into memory for many residents. But for Robin's family, time did not dull the absence. It simply deepened the questions. Birthdays came and went without her. Holidays passed with the quiet weight of what was missing. Her daughter grew from a toddler found unharmed in a silent house into an adult carrying the invisible imprint of a crime she was too young to remember but never truly free from. Through it all, the family held onto one fragile but persistent belief: that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. By the early 2000s, forensic science was entering a new era. What had once been cutting edge in 1993 was rapidly becoming outdated. DNA analysis, once slow and limited, was growing more sophisticated each year. Databases expanded. Techniques improved. Cases long considered unsolvable began to stir back to life across the country. Cold case detectives in Fairfax County were watching closely. Because buried inside the Lawrence case file was a critical piece of evidence that had always held promise: biological material recovered from the original crime scene. In the early years, the profile it produced had yielded no match in traditional law enforcement databases. It sat there, identified but unclaimed, like a fingerprint with no name attached. For years, that is where it stayed, until technology caught up. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, a powerful new investigative tool was transforming cold casework across the United States: forensic genetic genealogy. The method, which had famously helped identify suspects in long unsolved cases, allowed investigators to use crime scene DNA not just to search criminal databases, but to build family trees through publicly available genealogy data. It was meticulous work, slow, part science, part historical research. But when it worked, it could reach backward through generations to identify individuals who had never themselves submitted DNA. In Fairfax County, detectives made a pivotal decision. Robin Lawrence's case would be re-examined using this new technology. Specialists began the painstaking process of reanalyzing the preserved DNA evidence. The sample was carefully prepared and entered into genealogical comparison systems designed to identify distant familial connections. At first, the results were broad, distant relatives, partial matches, the kind of early signals that require months of careful genealogical mapping. Investigators and genealogists worked methodically, building family trees branch by branch, generation by generation. Names were cross-referenced, timelines aligned, geographic histories examined. Slowly, the field of possibilities began to narrow. One family line began to stand out. And within that line, one name began to draw increasing scrutiny: Darrell Rice. For investigators who had spent decades with the Lawrence case, the development was both electrifying and sobering. Rice was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. His background, once reviewed alongside the new genetic evidence, raised immediate and serious concern. Detectives began quietly compiling his history, comparing timelines, locations, and behavioral patterns. What they found was deeply unsettling. Rice had a criminal past involving violent conduct. More importantly, investigators discovered geographic overlaps that placed him in Northern Virginia during the early 1990s. The pieces were not yet conclusive, but they were aligning. To move forward, detectives needed confirmation, the kind that would stand up in court after 30 years of unanswered questions. They needed his DNA. Obtaining that confirmation required careful planning. Investigators conducted discreet surveillance, monitoring Rice's movements while building the legal foundation necessary to collect a comparison sample. Eventually, through lawful means, they obtained DNA believed to belong to him. The testing process that followed was both routine and monumental. Inside the lab, analysts compared the newly obtained sample to the preserved evidence from the 1993 crime scene. When the results came back, the match was clear. After more than 3 decades, the unknown DNA profile that had lingered in the Fairfax County evidence system finally had a name attached to it: Darrell Rice. The arrest that followed carried the weight of 30 years of waiting. When Rice was taken into custody, the news moved quickly through both law enforcement circles and the Lawrence family. For those who had followed the case closely, the moment felt almost surreal: the sudden shift from cold case to active prosecution after so many silent years. In Springfield and beyond, the development reopened old memories. For Robin's family, it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. But it also brought something that had been painfully absent for decades: movement, progress, the possibility of answers. The courtroom proceedings that followed were measured and deliberate. Prosecutors understood the significance and the challenges of presenting a case rooted in evidence collected in 1993 but confirmed through modern science. They laid out the forensic timeline carefully: the preserved DNA, the genealogical investigation, the final laboratory match. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the path that had led from a quiet suburban home in 1993 to a courtroom more than 30 years later. For the defense, the passage of time itself became a point of focus. Memory fades, witnesses become harder to locate, context grows more difficult to reconstruct. But DNA does not forget. And in this case, it spoke with unusual clarity. For Robin Lawrence's family, the proceedings were both painful and necessary. Each day in court meant revisiting the worst moment of their lives, but it also meant moving closer to the accountability they had sought for more than 3 decades. There is no such thing as true closure in cases like this. Only answers. Only the quiet knowledge that the person responsible has finally been named and held to account. As the legal process reached its conclusion, the emotional tone inside the courtroom was subdued but heavy with meaning. The long arc of the case, from 1993 to the modern era of forensic genealogy, had finally come full circle. Robin Lawrence, a young mother whose life was stolen in the privacy of her own home, was no longer just the subject of an unsolved file. Her case had spoken again, and this time it had been heard. Outside, the years continued to move forward in Springfield, just as they always had. Rain fell softly across northern Virginia on quiet evenings. Porch lights flickered on at dusk. Families settled into the routines of ordinary life, the same routines that had once surrounded Robin's final days. But now, threaded quietly through the history of the community, was a different kind of memory. One shaped by patience, by persistence, by the slow but powerful evolution of science and justice working hand in hand. Because sometimes, even after decades of silence, the truth still finds its way home. And for Robin Lawrence, and for the families who never stopped waiting, the long night of uncertainty had finally begun to lift, one careful step at a time, as the steady rhythm of rain continued to fall.